Thank you so much for coming. So we're going to talk today about security, and specifically security of low-power sensors, of course. That's why we're here. And I can tell you a little bit about my background so you all can understand the point of view, really, that I'm coming from. So, as Chris mentioned, I actually had started my career by working very much in low-power computing devices myself, specifically security and privacy of radio frequency identification tags. Of course, we're in this particular case, we're talking about passively powered sensors rather than actively powered sensors with a battery. But of course, there's very, very many things in common. And I do want to share some stories, some experiences that I had from those about 7 or 8 years that I was working on that particular topic. So first of all, when talking about the Internet of Things, and when talking about anything where you are dealing with power limitations, there's a number of problems that one typically has. And not surprisingly, this problem is related to energy consumption, right? We're already trying to keep energy consumption low because we expect to have huge amounts of, huge periods of time in which we can have radio communications, hopefully across a distance of some kind, and we want it to happen on a single battery, if possible. However, crypto takes power. This is not really very surprising, but this is oftentimes the part where things go wrong. So, for example, things just like, and I've seen this a whole lot, simple things like basic authentication, basic end-to-end encryption, the kinds of tools that we tend to take for granted on the internet, of course, become extremely challenging on sensors. Sometimes I've seen folks compensate by doing things like trying to develop their own low-power crypto algorithms. I have to say, this rarely goes well. For example, from the RFID domain that I was, myself more active in, but of course we just have to think back to about 2007-ish, when, for example, MyFair from Philips for the RFID tags was basically reverse engineered and then cracked. If you come up with your own low-power crypto, the problem is, it's just what Bruce Schneier says. Anytime you try and come up with your own crypto, most likely you're not going to get it right. In fact, even when most cryptographers come up with crypto, they tend to not get it right. And that's the reason why, usually for new cryptographic ciphers, there usually are competitions. A lot of different cryptographers submit their ciphers into, competitions that then can be analyzed and then judged collectively by all the cryptographers of the world. Even the trained cryptographers make mistakes. And it's really only a lot of scrutiny and withstanding the test of time that allows a crypto cipher to really offer you any kinds of guarantees that you can really count on for the longer term. So first of all, my first piece of advice is don't try and reinvent the wheel, right? Even if it's proprietary, and even if you think that some kind of security by obscurity is going to save you, that's typically not the way that it works. Just because something is closed, just because something is, company secret, does not mean that a smart hacker with an oscilloscope and a bit of knowledge of how, computer engineering works, that they can't pull that apart, reverse engineer it, and then that can fall victim then to such attacks. Other kinds of problems that you tend to have in ciphers like this are related to randomness. Similar kinds of issues. Because anytime you have cryptographic ciphers, part of the security of that particular cipher really depends upon, your having some random seed that is, random enough, aka not predictable enough, that then attackers cannot take, essentially be able to, recreate that seed somehow and then be able to use that to crack your crypto cipher. This is another really frequent problem that I see, with, again, sort of roll your own low power kinds of crypto systems. The problem is, of course, real randomness takes power to create. But precisely on sensors, you don't have that power available to you. So, then at that point, really all you have available to you is pseudo-randomness, of course, and then, getting some value, from somewhere. Oftentimes it could be from, some other server or something like that. All I have to say is just be careful, because if the way in which you construct that random seed is predictable, then this is also a very frequent pathway that hackers will also use to attack your systems, just because you don't have enough power available to be able to get some real source of randomness in your sensor. So these are some really common pitfalls. Also specifically with, LoRaWAN, of course, oftentimes you have spectrum hopping, and then people make claims that, but because we have some spectrum hopping going on here, we think this offers us security. That's not how it works, Because again, most of the time also with spectrum hopping, the way in which it's hopping through the spectrum is predictable, because if it's not, then of course the receiver wouldn't be able to receive, in the same fashion. So the point is that, this stuff is security by obscurity at best. So it means that you really need to count on tried and true old crypto, old protocols, as much as possible, sort of tested things, and don't just think that either keeping something secret or having some security by obscurity is necessarily going to save you against the hackers. So anyway, this is, I guess, a first couple of things that sort of I've noticed. Also given that I have a penetration testing company that also regularly tests Internet of Things kinds of devices. So for the rest, depending on how much power you do have available to you, for the rest, probably your systems are more or less just computers, which have source code and probably some real-time operating system. And again, the same kinds of entryways that hackers will use to get into other kinds of computer systems, of course, those same hackers will also use, to get also into your sensor networks. So it's not surprising, in a world of IoT, that everything now is getting owned. Really, everything. Of course, botnets nowadays oftentimes tend to be created out of IoT junk, that's connected to the internet. There's constant internet-wide scans, that are constantly running from folks like scans.io and Shodan, and there's constant crap. And of course, the problem with a lot of IoT stuff is it's just cheap garbage, and oftentimes it's not being updated properly. This stuff creates botnets. One of the more recent botnets, well, it's not that recent anymore, maybe about a year and a half ago, I think. But of course, the attack against Brian Krebs was this incredibly huge denial of service attack that was created by unpatched webcams. You need to understand as a manufacturer or as a user of this technology that if you don't either create the systems to allow this to get patched, or if you're not patching yourself as a user, you are creating a problem that's causing all this internet-wide junk to be out there. Also, other IoT devices that you don't even think of are part of botnets nowadays. Everyone knows about Tesla, and Tesla has onboard computers. One time, somebody actually managed to create a Bitcoin miner that was using Tesla onboard computers. And I would have to say that's probably the most expensive Bitcoin miner ever. But, hackers are creative, so you've got a lot of that kind of stuff. Also, critical infrastructure, things like gas, electro, water. Of course, this is also a huge IoT space, but for me, this kind of stuff is scary and you need to be careful. If you think about something like the electricity network, as a hacker, if I want to fully disrupt society, the first thing I would do is go after the electricity grid. Because, of course, once the electricity is gone, then pretty much everything else in society fails. But if you think about it, just with electric cars, things like those little, charging poles, right? Those things are everywhere. And oftentimes with these kinds of, smart devices, with of course they're registering the amount of consumption, and they're turning the electricity on and off. So these things sometimes have a direct connection into the energy network. If you talk to people who work for energy companies and ask them about the security of these charging poles, anyway, ask them sometime, but they probably don't want to talk about it in public. But, the problem that I'm saying is that when you're dealing with those kinds of things, and you have similar issues with things like smart meters, you're also tying into critical infrastructure, which also has its own risks. So treat that appropriately. So I would say the next point that I want to make is that many of us also, as manufacturers, we sort of tend to want to, build our own little bastions. And especially when we're doing security, we're developing our own little wheel at our own company. Our own security systems. But the problem is that if you think about the cybercrime ecosystem nowadays, if you think about the attackers, they have an entire collaborative ecosystem, right? Because nowadays with cybercrime, you've got all of these different moving pieces, all of these different actors that work together. So for example, you've got people who write malware, you've got people who drop malware, you've got people who, are in call centers that answer the telephones to, provide customer support for the pieces of malware. I'm not joking. It's really like this. You've got translators that, help to translate phishing mails into different languages. Really, the criminals nowadays, they specialize. And also they work in companies and organizations that are very similar to the software companies that we have, that we're incredibly familiar with. One time I heard an anecdote, though, that said that the org chart of a typical cybercriminal organization is almost identical to that of your typical Silicon Valley company. There's only one extra position in the cybercriminal organization that the Silicon Valley company does not have. And that's the hitman. So, but except for that, things are quite professional these days, and they are working together as an integrated industry. However, on the defender side, you've got all of these different companies that are developing their own incompatible systems. They are keeping information about being hacked to themselves. They are not sharing information about threats. They are not sharing information about compromises, And truthfully speaking, in the world that we are in today, we can no longer afford to do that. Because if we build our own silos, if we remain stratified, the point is, if the attackers are working together, then how do we as the defenders ever think that we will be able to keep up? We can't. Which essentially requires, ironically enough, not an approach of being as closed as possible, but actually it really requires an approach of being as open and as collaborative as possible. So, in such a way, we need to understand that we've got this scarcity mindset, right? We've got these secrets, we've got these technologies, we've got this knowledge, and it's ours. But we are moving into a world, with abundance, with exponentiality. We have to change our mindset in order to keep up. So, the financial industry is one industry that kind of gets it right. There's this one particular story that I like to tell. It's back from the days when I used to work at the cybercrime team at ING Bank. Okay? So one time we had a particular incident, and the banks essentially were under attack from a distributed denial of service attack. Okay? I was at ING Bank. We were in the newspapers because we were offline. They were writing political cartoons, and when you start seeing little funny lions, in political cartoons, you're not super happy about this. The board, basically the C-level executives were in the war room trying to figure out what to do. The firewall engineers at ING, they picked up the phone and they called the firewall engineers at the Rabobank. And then they started swapping, firewall rules across these two banks. See, they recognized that they were facing exactly the same threats, and if they shared information, that would make both parties stronger. This leads to the observation that in cybersecurity, your company has no competitors. Stop and think about this. In cybersecurity, your company has no competitors. Why is this? Because, the competitor, the real competitor in this case, is the attacker. It's the bad guys. It's the cyber criminals. And all of us in our own individual companies, we are, we cannot afford to not work together. We are not in competition, and we can get much further by sharing. So the bank, with this mentality, they created these data sharing communities. And for example, there's some groups, they have these things called ISACs, ISAC, which are basically these industry vertical groups. And they get together, of course they have NDAs in place just to make sure that their competitors aren't going to run to the press and, say, oh, guess what, they just got hacked, But once the appropriate NDAs are in place, then what they do is they share these things called indicators of compromise, IOCs. And IOCs are essentially pieces of information that you can then collaboratively, you can basically operationalize doing monitoring on, filtering on. It's like email addresses that you could put into your spam filter, or IP addresses or domain names that you can also put into your monitoring or your filtering systems. It's actual operational stuff that you can use. But because all of the banks together are working to analyze and get threat data, and then they're sharing it in these closed communities, then essentially, the threats that are going to attack one bank, they're going to hit one bank first, but then they're probably going to hit the next bank and the next bank and the next bank and the next bank. So what any bank sees is actually relevant to the entire group. Now stop and think about this. Is there some kind of an industry vertical group security-wise for IoT? Is there some kind of an industry vertical group, for LoRa, LoRaWAN, or for LPWAN over, in general? If not, why not? Because the threats that are going to be affecting one vendor or the threats that are going to be affecting one system are extremely likely also to be affecting the other vendors and the other systems as well. So we can get much further by getting together, presenting how we got hacked and what kinds of security problems we were facing, and working together on solutions. So another thing that I think we can keep in mind is that there's a lot of open source that's available to us. And keep in mind, with open source, a lot of this is already studied, a lot of this is already vetted, by a large community. Look, I'm not going to imply that open source is perfect, because of course it is not. We most certainly have, OpenSSH problems and bash problems and, web server problems as often, but then proprietary software isn't any better. All I have to do is say Citrix, and you guys, understand that, really software on both sides of the fence faces the same sets of issues. But at least with open source, you have the advantage that there's more people looking at it, and then when problems are reported, they're more likely to get, the vulnerability information spreads faster, and the responsible disclosure probably happens faster, and then the patch can get spread faster. And this really also brings us to related topics of things like privacy-enhancing technologies. There's a lot of great research out there, and you should familiarize yourself with it. Just because you're a sensor network doesn't mean you don't have to think about privacy. Your sensor network is going to be just as susceptible to things like the GDPR as any other kind of system. But of course, Who here is actually thinking about the GDPR when you're just trying to measure the temperature, somewhere on a farm? But nonetheless, these systems, too, you have to consider the kinds of data that you're collecting. Because oftentimes, people don't think about this, but farming data, for example, is critical infrastructure. And when we talk about critical infrastructure, we think about water, we think about power, we think about, these kinds of things, transportation. But nobody thinks about really simple things like the fertility of cows, right? We need to know when cows are fertile, so basically we can, inject, stuff at the right time so then they can have little baby cows. The entire dairy industry in the Netherlands relies upon this. However, if a hacker were able to manipulate these sensors that are taking the temperature measurements in the cows, determining when their fertility is, this could enable, hackers to disrupt an entire industry in the Netherlands. This isn't just some little toy sensor setup that you're using as part of a little research project. We're talking about one of the major industries in the country. And if that isn't critical infrastructure, well, I actually don't know what is. So we need to understand that, it's really easy just because our sensors are low power to kind of brush it off and say, oh, well, who cares actually? It's just little sensors and they're distributed and they're tiny and weak, who cares? But this can have really huge implications. This can have really huge ramifications. And I think we don't spend enough time thinking about this. So another thing also is you should keep in mind that the more open your design is, it's like Linus Torvalds says, many eyes makes bugs shallow. But on top of this, the truth is, when you ask people, what is it that you want to protect? Oftentimes at the beginning of penetration tests, ethical hacks that my company performs, I will ask customers, what do you want to protect? The typical default answer is everything. I'm like, really? Everything? And they're like, yeah, everything. And then I say, okay, but do you know what it would cost if you really want to spend all this time, on everything? And they're like, well, I'm sure we have enough money. I can basically do a back-of-the-envelope calculation of the amount of man-hours it would cost us to help them with everything. They fall off their chair. And then I say, okay, what do you really care about? And that's the thing. You're never going to have enough money. You're never going to have enough time. You're never going to have enough personnel to actually be able to secure everything. It's just not possible, which means that you need to understand what's important and you need to set priorities. This is one of the more important things in security. But what we also don't realize is the more things that we open up, the less we have to protect. See, that's the thing. It's not that we have to put all of our eggs in one basket and watch that basket, but it's more just that we need to put, I think, as little as possible into that basket and really say, what are my crown jewels? I know I can't protect everything, so what is it that is most important to me? And when you ask yourself, what are my crown jewels? You also then afterwards need to ask yourself the related question, what does the attacker think my crown jewels are? Because those two questions, don't always have the same answer. And then once you figure out what those crown jewels are, focus on protecting those, And then the irony is, again, people think that being closed is going to get you extra security. But the real truth of the matter is, if something is open, nobody can compromise it. If something isn't top secret, it's like open source. If source is open, nobody can steal it, right? So the irony is, the more transparent you are, the smaller your attack surface is, which makes you better able to protect what you actually have to protect. Think about this. Another thing that I would encourage folks to look into is responsible disclosure. So what this means, oftentimes if researchers or random people contact your company and say, your stuff is broken, you're lucky if you don't get a letter back from their lawyer. But that's really not helpful. Security consultancy is expensive. I can tell you this as the director of a security company, you know? So if somebody comes up to you and they say, here's a security problem, you need to say thank you because they just gave you a gift. You know, they're lucky they didn't send you an invoice, you know, for the work that they did. So the point is, if people come up to you, you know, with vulnerability information, you need to make it as painless as possible to receive that vulnerability info so you can fix it, patch it, and then get that patch out to the general public as quickly as possible. What can help to facilitate this is the creation of a responsible disclosure policy. You know, I'm guessing that probably many of you here in this room do not already have a responsible disclosure policy. The Dutch National Cybersecurity Center, the NCSC, has some really good guidelines that you can find. They're translated into both Dutch and English, and they show what an example responsible disclosure policy can look like. I highly recommend that you have a look and, you know, see if this is something you can use and integrate into your own organization. You can also go further and create something called a bug bounty policy. In this particular case, not only are you not sending lawyers after the folks who are doing reporting, but you're actually compensating them. You know, it could be a small cash amount, it could be a t-shirt, whatever. But the point is, you know, there are also bug bounty platforms, things like HackerOne, BugCrowd, Synac. You know, there's a number of these platforms. I highly encourage you to check them out. You know, it's a really good way of crowdsourcing vulnerability information, and this too can help you even with building your sensors. So do keep in mind, though, that bug bounty programs are not the same thing as penetration tests. It's not a cheap way of doing pen testing, because, of course, the kinds of people who do vulnerability testing for a t-shirt probably have slightly less skill and experience than those who do it for 100 euros an hour. So do bear that in mind, that it's not a substitute also for proper pen testing. The next thing that you should realize is that there's a lot of free education out there that you can take advantage of. You don't need to hire in expensive companies like mine to provide trainings for you. There's actually plenty of training that's out there available for free on the internet that you can benefit from. I would say one of the best ways to get experience with hacking is to play capture the flag. So these are essentially hacking competitions. There's a platform called ctftime.org, and they host competitions every single weekend. There's also war games, and these are also platforms that are available online 24/7. They also have sort of world ranking lists of people. This is the best way to learn. And as they commonly say in security, you do not know how to defend your system until you know how to attack your system. So this is a super valuable thing for you to do. Also keep in mind, it's available for free, you know, and this is great. Another thing also is if you want to get more experience and community with hackers, there's these things called hacker spaces, right? And there's all kinds of enthusiasts. I mean, some of you might already be familiar with this, and also with the related concept of maker spaces. Of course, this is very much fits in with the ethos of making and building, and also with, you know, sensors and radio. You know, a lot of hobbyists also tend to be plugged into these networks. But in either case, check them out, because sometimes they also have security trainings and CTF teams and great things that you can benefit from. Great community, and it's available for free. The last thing that I want to say is just understand that security is a process and security is a mindset. Security is not a set of patches that you receive after you receive a penetration test report. I mean, ultimately, in the end, security is always a set of trade-offs. It's a set of trade-offs for the attackers, for the amount of effort that they have to do. You know, how do you, how much benefit are they gaining from it, you know? And also similarly with the defenders, you know, how secure do you want to make yourself versus how much effort and money do you want to pay to actually make yourself secure? In the end, it's a little bit like bicycle locks in Amsterdam. There is no perfect security, and you don't need a perfectly secure bicycle lock. Sadly enough, you just need a slightly uglier bicycle, and a slightly stronger lock than your neighbor's. And that actually also is how the cybercrime ecosystem works. Anyway, with that, I just want you to consider things like continuous integration, continuous deployment, basically DevSecOps, understanding that security is not a one-time thing. It's a cyclical thing that you need to do over time, because in the end, you don't need to be perfectly secure, but you always do need to think about constantly raising the bar. With that, I'm going to wrap this up. I really thank you so much for your time and attention, and if any of you have any questions, I'll be sticking around. So thank you so much.